Everybody, my name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Karis Circle. Karis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Karis Books, and Karis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are so excited to be here with all of you tonight to celebrate Young and Restless, the girls who sparked America's revolutions. And we are joined by the author, Mattie Kahn, in conversation with Vox alum, Mikayla Kendall. This event is co-sponsored by Vox Atlanta. Vox Atlanta's mission is to lead a youth voice movement where teens from diverse backgrounds create a stronger, more equitable community through leadership and uncensored self-expression. I'm always excited when we are able to work with Vox because I am an alum from the 90s, and Vox gave me so much, so many skills around writing, but really gave me so many lifelong friends. So I am just thrilled to have Mikayla here with us. So I'm going to introduce Mikayla first. Mikayla is an 18-year-old student studying neuroscience as well as being a Vox ATL alum. She is a passionate advocate for human rights, particularly women's health. Mikayla has published articles regarding women's rights and treatment in healthcare. Mikayla can't wait to start making the change she wants to see. And we are joined by Mattie Kahn, who is an award-winning writer and editor. Her work has been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, Harper's Bazaar, Vogue, Vox, and more. Different Vox, other Vox. She was the culture director at Glamour, where she covered women's issues and politics, and a staff writer at Elle. She lives in New York with her husband. And so we're so glad to have you both here. We want to let folks know that they can ask questions at any time. And in fact, we do prefer y'all to ask questions early as they occur to you. Don't be shy. Go ahead and put them in there so that we're not saving them all to the end. So if you put them in the chat or in the ask a question place, that either way is good, so that Mikayla and Mattie can see them. So I'm going to go ahead and get out of the way because I'm really excited to hear this conversation. But welcome to you both. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. Now, can I just say, this book, so good. And when I say that, I really mean it from the heart because I am not a nonfiction fan.
Okay.
But this book, I was actually not bored at all. And as I was reading, I was like, I never knew that. And some of the stuff in here, it seems like things that would be taught or that you would know, but it just wasn't. So what was it like kind of like going along in research and learning all these untold stories?
Yeah, I mean, I had the same experience. Like in the research for the book, I found a lot of stories that I didn't know, or even sides of stories that I thought I knew that I realized how much I didn't know. I feel like I got a great education, and yet I write in the book, I think I learned about like 2 teenage girls in my entire wonderful education, Anne Frank and Sacagawea, and I think that's just about it. So these stories were missing from my life too. And one of the reasons that I spent so much time researching the book before I even started writing and before I even finished the proposal was because I just felt like the void of how much I didn't know and how much I needed to find. I think there were many times where I was, the idea of the book is theorizes obviously that girls have been on the forefront of social change. But when I came up with that concept, I also had to kind of hope that it was really true and that it would continue to be borne out, that the more research I did, that the truer it would become. And I did have this feeling sometimes of like, oh my God, there it is again. Like there is another girl who's done something incredible, whose actions helped spark this incredible movement or protest or demonstration, who, I know as a reasonably educated person who cares about history, the part that came next. And yet that early story has totally been written out of the record for me. So there was a sense of validation in working on the book, that it kept being true. But I also felt kind of sorry for my teenage self, because I think if I had known these stories when I was in high school, I would have felt really differently even about my own possibilities. And I feel like not telling these stories and not giving young women and young men and, people of all genders the opportunity to learn from young women, it robs them of something really profound. So I am so glad you like the book. I think a young person's response to the book is like the highest estimation of how it's doing and how much I did or didn't achieve. And I also just hope that it continues to be read, because I feel like there's so much power in knowing these stories.
There really is. Like, even when you first started off with the Material Girls chapter, you know, the whole buildup of this amazing world of these girls working in the factory, they're learning from each other, they're learning from experience, and then it all just kind of crashes down once they've kind of hit their limit. What commentary almost do you have to say about the limitations that was placed on these girls?
Yeah, I mean, I think that before the civil rights movement and before feminism comes along, as you know from having read it, the first half of the book has a lot of stories like that, which is really heartbreaking. A lot of girls who do incredible things, and then you think like, yes, you have the rest of your life to keep doing amazing things, and the opportunities for them to seize that kind of power are just not available. So in the case of the Lowell Mill girls, these are girls who came from all over New England, farmers' daughters, who went to work in these new textile mills, got paid more than they could have ever imagined being paid at the time, had no other hope really of having a career, maybe as a teacher, but not much else. And they get this opportunity to be together and, like you said, to learn from each other. And yeah, it seems like it's all hurtling toward this amazing conclusion where you're going to see the power and the might. But I think it's always been the case that if someone wants to stamp girls out and wants to, kind of throw water on the fire of their passion, those forces can be really powerful too. And they certainly mobilized to, I think, rob the girls of their agency. I think the nice thing, and I'm sure this will come up again, is that story feels like a real heartbreak to me. And yet we know that generations of young women and all people learned from the example of the Mill Girls and read their writing. And I think the nice part about it is that those stories really did and have lived on, and inspired subsequent generations of activists. So one of the things that I hope to do in ordering the stories in this way was to show how even things that feel like a real failure in their moment can reverberate and inspire people, decades later, that the Lowell Mill Girls could never have imagined that they would be read in the 1970s by second wave feminists.
Yeah. And you know what? Another thing that I kind of appreciated about the Mill Girls was I feel like a lot of times feminists are often painted as like tomboys and not really, even though they're feminists, they're not in touch with the certain level or aspect of femininity. So it was interesting to see like when they were writing their magazine and they were actually talking about things that really interest them, and they weren't just limited to their agency. They were whole selves. Did you find it difficult? Because throughout the book, you give girls and teenagers and these women, you give them a background, whereas before it was kind of more of just what they did.
Yeah.
Was it difficult to find that their backgrounds, like their true stories, like them as a whole, as you were researching?
Yeah, super hard. I mean, one of the things that I feel about the book is like for every story that's in there, there are stories that we just don't know because nobody ever wrote them down. I think that is like one of the profound things about trying to write, women or any marginalized group of people. Obviously, women should not be marginalized as 51% of the population, but we know that this is the case. Trying to put those stories back in, there's just so much that we don't have. So I was always struggling against what's not there. The nice thing is, there used to be a lot of newspapers in this country and a lot of people wrote about a lot of things, and thanks to amazing efforts on the part of archivists and librarians, there are, you can access these first person or real-time accounts of what it was like, the people who saw them. But I did really want to get their own voices in there. I mean, one of the things that comes up in the Lowell Mill Girl chapter, which I was so surprised to find and just like delighted in as a magazine editor myself, is I loved finding out what they spent their money on, because it's such a powerful thing. I think to be a young person, you have, X number of dollars and you can decide what you want it to be for. And some girls saved for education and some girls bought themselves clothes and bought themselves watches and boots. And, I could, between their accounts and sort of like their plans from the city, I could sort of reconstruct like this store was on this corner and they would go there after work and that kind of thing. And I really loved that. And one of the things that really made me laugh is in one of the magazines that they worked on, I don't know if you have seen this kind of formula come up in women's media, but there's an incredibly popular column on Refinery 29 called Money Diaries that's been around for a really long time, where people talk about, women in particular talk about how they spent their money for a week. And literally the Lowell Mill girls were doing money diaries in the 1830s, writing into the newspaper and to their magazine saying, I bought this on Monday and then I bought that on Tuesday. And I kind of did it and included all of that, knowing that maybe some people would say, well, that's not part of their activism, buying clothes or caring about what they're wearing. That's you shouldn't include that because you're making them seem frivolous. That was something I felt so strongly about. I really feel like history tells us that how you choose to show up in a space, it's not apolitical and it's definitely not frivolous. And for a person who's not being listened to, it can sometimes be like your most powerful tool. So all of that stuff felt really critical to me. And then another thing that I tried to do in all the chapters, I tried to choose girls whose voices are in the historical record. There's a million people in this book. First of all, it already feels like there's a lot of girls in this book, but there could have been even more. And I really wanted to include people who spoke for themselves, didn't just have people write about them, because I think that that's one of the things that our culture does to girls, really uses them for their visual impact or as a metaphor. And I wanted to remind people, like, these were real people who lived and did things and had lives outside of just the activism.
And then kind of jumping off that, one of the girls that really stood out to me, well, I had two, but I'll talk about the first one that stood out to me, was Claudette Colvin. And what really, I had learned about her in middle school, but she was a sentence, and just kind of getting her expanded story was like amazing. I had never knew that, her and Rosa Parks like actually had a relationship. Like, that was amazing to think about. Like, I kind of always pictured them as like two separate entities, but throughout the book, you kind of talk about how everybody is intertwined. And you know what? It was just really cool to see. But the one sentence that really got to me is when they had misspelled her name, and and I couldn't believe it after they had just, kind of like dismissed what she had done, how she kind of like started a chain reaction. They misspelled her name. When you researched that and when you found that, how did you feel? Like, what was your reaction to that?
Oh my God, there are so many moments in this book where you wish you could just literally reach through time and like hug someone or say, that's so messed up. I'm so sorry this is happening to you. That detail, it's like a dagger. It's like this young person is ready to sacrifice everything for this movement that she believes in so much. All she wants in the world is acceptance by the people that she looks up to so much. And then this flyer comes to her house kind of totally anonymously, and her name's not even right on it. It's like the agony of that. I think especially anyone who's been a teenager knows that feeling of like that sudden hot feeling of feeling embarrassed because you've been shamed publicly in some way. And there's not a person who's been through high school that doesn't know what that feels like. And for it to happen on such a dramatic stage, it broke my heart. But I agree that even I didn't know until I started doing this work about this, like you said, real relationship between Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin. And I try, not to be a conspiracy theorist at all, but I do feel there's a reason why those kinds of things aren't emphasized in our education, because I think one of the things we don't do well in education in this country, and probably in many places, is like really talk about how power is built. What really helps start movements? How do people really organize? And one of the ways that happens is people know each other. These communities are not huge. And the fact that their relationship was so close that, there was a one-off kind of line in one of the documents that I was reading for this chapter about how Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin knew how the other took her coffee. It's like the most intimate detail that Claudette spent nights at Rosa Parks's house. I just really wanted to show that, it's not just that there's one exceptional girl and then a few years later somebody else does something amazing. All of these forces build on each other and help people see what's possible. But yeah, I think if you hear what the book is about, I think it's easy to feel like this is a rah girl power story of how incredible girls are and how girls can do anything. And I am so inspired by the girls in this book, and I'm so in awe of Claudette Colvin. I mean, we could spend this whole time talking about just her story, but the fact that she gets turned away from the movement again and again, and she keeps volunteering to be part of it, I think is amazing. But I really wanted to show progress and the process of building these kinds of movements. It's not without sacrifice on the people who do that. And it's not like everyone is so united and it's this uplifting process. It can cost you a lot to be part of it. And I felt like, don't we owe the girls that to tell that part of the story too?
Right. Because before it's kind of just they did this, great. Now it's kind of, they did this, but in return, they didn't get this. They just kind of got left in the dirt.
Yeah.
It's really crazy to think about. But I want to kind of go back to what you were saying about it's about knowing people. As you're talking about in like the chapters that kind of go after Claudette Colvin in the cliques chapter, you kind of go into how friendships can be, you talked about how it could be really good, but in some cases when it came to like the division between, you know, during the civil rights movement, the division between the cliques of Black young women who are activists and white young women who are activists, it kind of didn't mesh.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that, listen, if you've been a young person, if you've had friends in high school, you know that sometimes it's not all like everyone sitting in a circle and singing songs together. I think that it was, you know, when you go back to that time, first of all, I think it's amazing that there was this period of unity that predated that at all. It is so hard to find common ground, and it's so hard to assume the best of intentions on both sides. You know, if you've been a person in a group of friends, you know how hard that can be. Yeah. I think that it's understandable in a lot of ways, these divisions that came up, or the feeling of, you know, some people, especially on the part of Black women, feeling like, you know, white women are in this a little bit as an extracurricular activity, and this is kind of our lives, and this is kind of what we need to be dealing with on a daily basis. Or people coming who aren't from the community, you know, people coming from the North, coming down to the South with like a savior mentality. It's not always going to be a feeling of that everyone's in this together. And I think particularly that everyone's risking the same thing. You know, it's a different feeling to come down, even though I think it's amazing how people mobilized around the civil rights movement and people from all over the country came, you know, for Freedom Summer. It's different if it's your Freedom Summer or if it's your life that, you know, that you live there and this is your neighborhood and this is your community and this is what you're dealing with. So I think in some ways those divisions are inevitable. One of the things that I wanted to do in highlighting that was, first of all, again, to say, I didn't want to tell a story about how girls are always so nice to each other. It's like, we know that that's not true, that emotions get involved and factions get involved, and it's not always a story of everyone, just getting along. If you've been to high school, you know that's true. But I also wanted to highlight that because many white women who were involved in the civil rights movement found that division painful, but they also realized, because of some of those, you know, broken relationships, that it was time for them to organize in their own communities. And so many women who were involved in women's liberation had come out of the civil rights movement. They had done this work and been inspired by it and wanted to see it come to fruition. And then they said, wait, there are things in our own lives that aren't fair. And so I think out of that painful rupture did come a sense of like, well, we need to organize our own people. You know, we need to organize white women. We need to organize around gender. Black women too realized, you know what, nobody's going to come to save us. I think a realization that Black women have unfortunately had to have for a long time. And out of some of those, you know, out of some of those divisions came further, you know, kind of reverberations for other movements. And so it felt important to tell that part of the story too.
Yeah. And what you said about girls not always being nice. Yeah, it's true. And I feel like that's where I felt like this book was very different, in that it didn't just kind of like sugarcoat all of their stories. It kind of, like I said, you made these girls and these women and these teenagers, you made them whole in their stories. But I also want to tie that back to, you included fashion as an important part in a girls' movement. Was that important to kind of like, because like I said, a lot of times feminists are painted as like more tomboyish and not really caring about things like fashion. Why do you think it was important to include just insignificant fashion can be in movements?
Yeah, well, that's my bias as someone who worked at Elle and at Glamour and worked in women's media my whole life. I mean, I included this quote in the book, but it really has always stayed with me. There's a fashion critic named Vanessa Friedman, and she has been a critic at the Financial Times and the New York Times. And she once wrote a piece in which she said, the world is not run by naked people. I think every person wears clothes. Every single person, the most powerful person and the person with the least power, everybody has to get dressed in the morning. So the idea that what you wear isn't a statement, it's always a statement. Even if what you're trying to say is, I don't care about my clothes, you are making a statement by doing that. And I felt like girls who are so aware of presence and appearance, it's like, of course, they're going to use that to their advantage when they can. And of course, they're going to be judged on what they wear too. And it seemed like this crazy avoidance of one of the key forms of power that a young person can have to not talk about that. You know, I write this in the book, but if you're under 18, you cannot vote, you cannot run for office, you cannot have many kinds of jobs. So what are the kinds of power that are available to you? One is definitely using your voice, protesting in that way, or, you know, organizing and gathering people and participating in demonstrations and marches. And one is, how do you show up in a space? Like, what are you going to wear? And so I didn't want to ignore that, definitely. And I think girls have really been savvy about that for a long time. I also think, as you know, a lot of people who have asked themselves, what should I wear to a job interview? Or, you know, what should I wear on a date? Like, you know, that there are also ways for clothes to go wrong. You think you're saying one thing with what you're wearing, and then you end up saying something you didn't mean to say. And those misfires too were interesting to me. And having to make choices that maybe, you know, about something you're going to wear that you wish you didn't have to wear. Again, I think back to the civil rights movement of decisions about, do I want to wear my Sunday best? Do I want to wear jeans and my hair in an afro? Those are all choices. And of course, there are political ramifications for those choices. One thing that I really loved and was really happy to include was just the role that hair salons played for Black women who were, you know, suffering the worst kinds of dehumanization and degradation when they were doing the work of integrating lunch counters. The fact that so many of them would write in their letters to their sisters or their aunts or their cousins, the second I got out of there, I went straight to the hair salon. I needed to get put back together. It's like, if they're telling you that that was key to the work that they're doing, you're doing everyone a disservice by not including that. That's so amazing to me. But yeah, I would, my colleagues at Elle and Glamour would not have been proud if I would have pretended that the history of social progress has not been influenced by fashion. I think it's so important. And I think the people who say that it's ridiculous don't realize how much it's already affected their own lives. One of the things that I always think about is, like, if you see a presidential debate on TV and one of the candidates shows up wearing a purple tie, you know, the CNN anchor is going to say, like, purple tie, a sign of, like, reaching out, a bipartisan gesture of red and blue put together. Okay, so fashion matters. So that means fashion matters.
It's true. And you also do make it a point to say it is all about the optics. Like, I think because for so long, girls and women have kind of been like invisible and almost just in the background. They needed something to stand out, like with Harriet Blatch and the march that she led. She was like heavily detailed in planning. It needs to look like this, and this.
Yeah.
And it was just really cool to see how that's what she really invested her time in, and that's what really got the attention. But whose story stood out for me in that was Mabel Ping.
Yeah, Mabel Ping-Hua Lee.
Yeah, that story, I mean, she did so many amazing things. First woman to get her doctorate from Columbia. I mean, and then you get to the kind of like with the Mill Girls, you get to the point where then the Depression hit, her dad died, and we will never really know if she was content, even though, you know. So can you talk to me a little bit about how her story affected you?
Yeah, totally. So just for background for people, Mabel Ping-Hua Lee was a Chinese immigrant, teenager, by all accounts, incredibly smart, went to a top high school in New York, grew up in Chinatown. Her father was a Chinese minister. And again, like when we're talking about the honesty of history, part of the reason that there were so few Chinese immigrants in New York at that time is because the US had these very draconian anti-immigration laws, particularly discriminating against Chinese people. So her father and her mother got in under a very narrow exception because he was a minister, and she came to and was born in China, and then went to high school in New York and got into Barnard. And when she was at Barnard, she was one of like 5 Chinese women in the whole school. She was heavily involved in organizing for women's rights among Chinese women, and very involved in student organizations to that effect. But she was, by all accounts, like this incredibly charismatic speaker. One of the little bits that I love from that is that a reporter writes that when she would talk to people and be gathered in front of these biggest groups of people, he said that people would leave Mabelized by her talks, like that she was so charismatic. People couldn't stop listening to her. And because she had talked about Chinese women's rights, she ended up talking about women's rights in the US and the vote in particular, because this is happening in 1912, 1913, 1910, just as suffrage is really exploding in New York, where she was. And, you know, mostly white women suffragists realized this girl is an incredible spokesperson for us. First of all, people aren't used to seeing Chinese women, so she draws a lot of attention in that sense, which I think there's, again, always a tension there of how much is she being fetishized versus how much agency does she have. And she was super aware of that. And then there was also the sense that, like, oh my God, she is so well spoken. And we know, and Harriet Blatch wrote about this extensively, she really liked young women to be on the forefront of the movement. She liked how they brought this vitality, how they looked so pretty, you know, that youth. Instead of having old women on the front line, she wanted young people to show, like, the future of this movement looks like this. This is what the next generation is going to do. She had this amazing line that I love, that I think about so much, where she said, the enemy must be converted through his eyes. That this idea of, like, if you're going to win people over, you better impress them with what you're showing them. It's not enough to write convincing editorials or get a lot of people in a room. Like, they need to be impressed by what they see. So she did that. She marched up Fifth Avenue on horseback in 1912 for this huge march, and she seemed destined for greatness. And like you said, she earned a PhD from Columbia. Maybe it's like my own feeling as an insecure humanities person, but when I heard it was in economics, I was like, oh my God, that's impressive. It's one thing to earn a degree in literature, but earning a degree in economics as a humanities person, I find impressive. And she had to get special dispensation from the State Department to leave the US and do her research in China, which she did. She had lots of friends who joined the Chinese government or who got involved in various sort of like high profile roles. They wrote to her. They were like, Mabel, you got to do this too. She obviously was so smart. But like you said, the Depression hit and her father died, and she decided to take over his very small church. And she didn't publish, and she didn't have a huge career, and she didn't become famous, and she didn't keep Mabelizing people with her incredible speeches. And for me, it was a chapter I wrestled over so much. It was, like I said about Claudette, like, it's that feeling of you want to go back in history and give something a different ending. And it's hard because we don't know. You know, there's a case where I wish that there was some diary hidden somewhere where Mabel writes, and I was really happy with the future I chose, and this was totally my decision. We don't know. And we don't know whether if she lived in a different time, she would have wanted something else, or if she was always really happy with the path that she chose. I think the point of the book is to dream of a world where girls have every choice available to them and they can choose freely. But it wasn't always the case. And I think teasing apart what she wanted versus what her options were is just so hard to do. So it does for me end on an ambivalent note, but I still think her contributions, especially knowing that she wasn't going to be able to benefit from suffrage in the US. She never got to vote. And she was subjected to terrible discrimination as an Asian woman. I find it all the more incredible that her will was so strong that it felt worth it to her to fight for people who were not really fighting for her.
Yeah. For me, she kind of really embodied like the common themes throughout the book, because we see how as she goes from being a girl into a woman, it's kind of like we kind of see that throughout the book. It's like that transition somehow kind of like knocks people out. And maybe it is that, you know, the allure of girls thing that kind of like downplays that. And then you also see her, you know, the cliques again, her kind of being used as more optics and not really being accepted into those places. So good to see. We do have a question. Since fashion plays such a big role in the history aspects of this book, Can you talk about some of the ways that contemporary girls are using fashion in revolutionary or movement building ways?
Yeah, definitely. So one of the things that I think girls rightly do is call back to previous movements and how they dress. So, and young women in particular. You've seen the march that Mabel was participating in. Women wore white. Suffragists historically have worn white, and you've seen that play out again and again. Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez is not a girl; she's a woman, but she often wears white for big moments of democracy or where she really wants to draw attention to herself because she's invoking that same visual language of the past. I mean, this is not happening right now, but there were, and this is part of the book, boycotts called girl cots against Abercrombie. When I was a teenager, it was the coolest store ever and very countercultural to organize against it, but they were selling t-shirts that girls found to be super demeaning, and girls organized around fashion, in that case in opposition to fashion, saying this isn't good enough to have us wear these clothes and to try to sell us these messages. And so fashion has also been something that people protested against. I think when you think of, fashion expansively in terms of like, how do you show up? It's not surprising that Greta Thunberg is often photographed with a backpack. A backpack is such a iconic visual signifier of childhood. And so, of course, it's going to be really powerful to see a young person carrying a backpack outside of school. You don't need to know anything about her to know, oh, she must be a student because she has a backpack. And I think those things are things that savvy activists are always aware of. I even think about things like, during the George Floyd protests of 3 years ago, you saw websites like Allure, which maybe you wouldn't think of as a hotbed of activist rhetoric, saying, here's the kind of makeup that's going to keep you safe. Here's how you make sure that you're not being surveilled. Maybe wear sunglasses, don't wear clothes with labels. I remember various fashion websites saying, write your phone number or the phone number of someone you want to be able to call should you get arrested on your arm. We don't necessarily think of those things as fashion, but I think about them in terms of the iconography of how you show up in a place for a protest as very much fashion. So I think fashion is a tool. It can be uniform, and it can also be something you organize against if you're not happy with what's being sold to you. At the end of the day, fashion is definitely a commodity, and so it participates in that culture of like, are we buying this or are we not buying it? And girls have always been part of that.
And, I find the optics of it all so important that I kind of want to touch on that. In the book, you say no one could compete with the allure of an American girl when talking about the mill girls. And like I said, common theme throughout the book, the optics. Do you feel like it was almost the fetishizing of young girls that played a role in the waves they were able to make?
100%. Absolutely. I do think that. And I also think it's important to be specific. I think when we talk about the allure of the American girl that people who were responding to the mill girls were thinking of, I think we have to be honest and say they were picturing white girls when they were wanting to lift up these amazing, idyllic girls of New England. And I write in the book about the really uneasy relationship that girls in the mills who felt so empowered had to what they were working with, cotton that was being grown by enslaved people. Those things are all part of this legacy too. One of the things I wanted to talk about in the book was like, who gets to be seen as a pure, innocent American girl? For way too long, the answer to that has been white girls. I think people still think of blonde hair, pigtails. These are the things that people revere about girls has so often been coded as white. And one of the things I wanted to write was that early civil rights activists were saying, no, I too am part of that category. And someone like Mabel Ping-Hua Lee was saying, I too am a child. I too am a girl. Expanding that definition, I think, is so important. And it's one of the reasons that, people have asked me, like, why even use the word girl? Like, shouldn't we be calling them young women? Or is it demeaning in some way to be called a girl? And I feel like generations of girls have fought to be seen as girls. So it's not for us to say, oh, no, I think you're too grown up for a term like that. I think so many girls have wanted to be seen as children, as young people worth protecting. And I think it's important to kind of check yourself. I felt this way in the process, like to check myself when I thought, who am I picturing? Or who were these people picturing when they talked about needing to protect girls? I think still now you see so much political action is organized around this idea of protecting children, that children need so much protection. And I think that's often used in a kind of manipulative way, to talk about protecting children or young people or adolescents without asking teenagers or young people what they really need. So that image has always been out sort of in the public square to be manipulated in some way by somebody who wants to use the image of the girl to their advantage. And even in less sinister ways, one of the first girls that's mentioned in the book is this girl, Sybil Luddington, who was rumored to have ridden farther and faster than Paul Revere. She's one of the first girls that I got interested in when I was working on this book. I felt like, oh my God, how perfect, a revolutionary girl, on horseback, warning her father about British troops. And then I come to find, as I'm trying to do this research, that some people say she never existed, that never even happened. Or maybe it kind of happened, but not in the way that people say. And I was really surprised because there were so many examples of people talking about that story on every side of the political spectrum, anti-communists talking about her as a patriot, and second wave feminists talking about her as this pioneering girl. And throughout every single generation, that story has been used as a defense or an argument on behalf of one cause or another. And where's the voice of that girl? We don't have it. That's a good place where I tried so hard to find, something from her life. But girls are always being used in that way. And that was one of the things that I tried so hard to do in the book, is not perpetuate that by telling stories about them that didn't feel true to their actual experiences.
So when it comes to Dickinson, do you think that allure kind of, because you say, when she became a woman, she became a punchline.
Yeah.
Do you think that allure just kind of like washes away somewhere in that transition, and that specifically just happened to her?
Yeah, so Anne Elizabeth Dickinson was the daughter of Quaker abolitionists in Philadelphia, became a really famous abolitionist speaker on sort of like the speaking circuit of her day, was the first woman ever to address the House of Representatives, yelled at Abraham Lincoln so much in this speech that he was literally the president of the United States, and he had his head in his hands because he felt so embarrassed by the things that she was saying. I did feel like, and I think that we know this too from having seen grown women do things like run for office, that there's a way that we kind of enjoy as a culture a young woman or even a young person kind of telling us off, that there's something about that feels like, oh, good for her. She's so sassy. She's so spunky. And we kind of accept that as like the price of adolescence. And then when women get older, I think if you've ever seen a woman criticized for being too shrill, too dramatic, too emotional, that allowance that we have for girls quickly goes away. So I think the instructive example is like, have you ever seen a Disney Channel star try to grow up? Like, it has not gone well. Often it's really, really hard. And I think that transition of being in the public eye, going from being seen as a child to being seen as an adult, particularly an adult woman, just becomes really complicated, partially because, girls are given this gloss, I think, of innocence, and you get older and you lose that sense. And people start to think of you as being less than, being less innocent, being less charming. And so it can be really hard to sustain that. Anne Elizabeth Dickinson tried to keep speaking and tried eventually acting and playwriting, and her standing just fell farther and farther and farther because she did seem like more of a joke. And I think it's so fortunate, even though it's not easy to live now, and it's not like the transition for girls now is so simple. I think we have slowly started to tolerate more from women, which means that there are more opportunities for girls to grow up and continue in their activism and continue to be visible.
And you say, I noticed how I found it interesting that, compared to Dickinson as a girl, where when, she spoke out, it was like you said, it was like, oh, wow, but then when it came to like more of the civil rights chapters, when you talk about Claudette Colvin, it was, oh, that was just impulsive. She was overly emotional, things like that. What do you think the kind of contrast that race brought into the situation with how these women were portrayed?
Totally. I mean, there's a moment where, so Claudette does her incredible thing, which is 9 months before Rosa Parks, she refuses to give up her seat on a segregated bus in Alabama. And she thinks for a brief moment that this long-standing dream of a Montgomery bus boycott is going to be her, with her at the center, that this action, she gets arrested, she thinks it's all going to organize around her. And then eventually the leaders of the movement sort of decide she's not our woman, she's not our girl. We need to wait for the right figurehead, the right moment for this kind of action. And so it becomes Rosa Parks in December 1955. And the boycott begins. And as we all know, it continues for months. I mean, the dedication of all of these people who participated is unbelievable. And the movement leaders are kind of looking around for, well, we need to capitalize on this. And they decide we want to bring a case to challenge segregation on buses. And they do. And they look for every upstanding man in the state, basically, to come be part of this case. They really try hard to find a minister. That's their dream. And if they can't find a minister, then like a businessman or a lawyer, someone who's really respected. And nobody wants to do it, not one. And in the end, there are 4 plaintiffs. 2 of them are teenage girls. All of them are women. And one of them is Claudette Colvin. And because her testimony is so emotional, they leave her for last on the stand. And when she is sitting there being questioned by the state, they press her so much. Who's really telling you what to do? What made you do this? Who told you to do this? And they want her basically to accuse Martin Luther King of kind of coming in and riling these girls up. Never mind that she definitely did not know him at the time, and that would never have happened. But they can't believe the idea that a Black girl would have this kind of foresight to say, this determination to say, I'm not happy with how things are and I'm going to change it, and I'm making that decision. And in the end, what she says on the stand is like, our leader is us. We make these decisions. And it stumps them. I mean, what do you say to that? And I think that that was a good example of a girl insisting on being seen as like the agent of her own cause and saying, nobody's telling me what to do. No one's pulling the strings. I think certainly like race is always part of these conversations. And so is sexuality and gender. How palatable you seem to the masses is always going to affect kind of the public reception that you get. But one thing that is kind of interesting about doing this and spending so many years in the archives is I think we see a lot now. People say, well, I would have more respect for these, for Gen Z demonstrators and organizers if they had the dignity of the Freedom Riders, before them. Let me tell you how people talked about the Freedom Riders. They were saying that they had no dignity and they weren't organizing in the right way. I think there's always going to be a desire to dismiss people who are challenging the status quo. And that's going to be doubly true for Black girls. And the fact that they've kept at it for literally centuries is a testament to just a single-mindedness that, no, the world has to be better than this.
Yeah, and that generation thing where it almost seems like, each older generation is never going to be happy.
Totally.
With the younger generation, it's just not going to happen. There's always going to be something wrong. So I found it interesting that, a lot of times Gen Z is referred to as over emotional and, should be more like these girls. But the truth is, I felt like part of their stories were like downplayed and their emotions. Who wouldn't be emotional? Like kind of what you said about Claudette Colvin, like who wouldn't be emotional? Who wouldn't cry?
Right. Yeah.
And things like that. So it's kind of crazy to see the comparison of, you think that, Susan B. Anthony gets told as the strong woman led the suffrage cause, most important woman to know. And you never talk about how hard that could have been, and kind of like giving a voice to that. And so I feel like that makes it a little bit harder for the older generation to then understand where a younger generation, it's already going to be hard.
Yeah. And I also think that like, to your point, I think when we tell those stories about people and we pretend, they never had doubts, they never let their emotions get in the way. If you're a person who wants change, you're asking yourself to measure up to this impossible standard. If you ever doubt yourself, well, then you're not Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks doubted herself literally all the time. Right before she did this world-changing thing, she literally was ready to give up activism completely. And If it weren't for young people, she may very well have done that. I think when we tell these stories about these flawless people who had no flaws, no questions about themselves, no vulnerabilities, we communicate this message that if you're not at that level, like, why bother? You're never going to be able to be like them. No, they were full people, and they messed up, and they, made really hard decisions. And sometimes they sacrificed their friends. Sometimes they sacrificed themselves and gave way too much of themselves. And that's the honesty that tells anybody, you can do this. You can be part of this thing. If we pretend every single one of these people was a saint, if you don't feel like you're a saint, you're not going to feel like you can make a difference. And that's just not true. I mean, I love the stories of these girls singing songs together in jail and getting into fights over boys and, doing all the things that girls do, because I hope that it says, if you're a regular person, there's no reason why you can't be one of these girls.
Exactly. And that's why, someone who also resonated with and kind of like telling, well, she was nervous the whole night before the morning of that, they did the sit-in. So it's crazy to kind of like connect that they were scared too, like that same like heart beating feeling you get when you're about to do something anxious. Activists get that too. So seeing their lives outside of activism was absolutely phenomenal. Yeah. So I do want to ask you, now that you've done all this research, you've published this amazing book, what do you think your definition of girlhood is?
Oh, wow. That's such a good question. I think that one of the tools that I always used, because when I first started the book, I was like, maybe I'll come up with an age range. And, if you're under this age or you're over this age, you don't belong in the book. And that felt way too strict to me, because I feel like how girls have seen themselves over time and how the world has seen them has changed. So, for example, we were talking about Anne Elizabeth Dickinson. She was in her early 20s when she addressed Congress. But when people wrote about her, they did not call her a woman. They called her a girl, because to them, that still, being single, unmarried, young, you still qualified as a girl. So I feel like girlhood to me is reserved for people who see themselves that way, who see the world through that lens, who feel that feeling of being a girl in the world. Like, if you feel that and you see yourself that way, that's good enough for me. And that's true if you're 10 or if you're 20 or if you're, trans or if you're cis or whatever it may be. Like, if you're looking out in the world and your experience of the world is of seeing the world that way, like, this is your story. I think that the thing that I felt going forward and working on the book was, obviously I wrote the book because I feel like girlhood is a powerful time, or I wouldn't have done it. I sometimes feel like it's like you're practicing a dark magic almost. You have so much power and you're trying to figure out how to express it and how to make other people see that. But what I felt was, whether we like it or not, girlhood is a time of transition. It is this bridge between these two different phases of life. And I think, like any kind of cleaving or rupture, there's a lot of energy that's unleashed in that time. And there's also tremendous vulnerability. I didn't want to make girls seem like superheroes. I didn't want to make it seem like nothing can touch them because they're so powerful. I wanted to say there's a lot of power and there's a lot of energy. And then there's, this tremendous burden and a feeling of, actually, you are porous and the world can hurt you. I didn't think it did anyone any favors to pretend that girls are invulnerable. It's not true. What we have to do is figure out how we can give them a safe space to experiment with that power, with their voices, and also make sure that it doesn't take them down in the process.
And what was because throughout the beginning of the book, it's talking about these girls' agency, how they're really stepping up to the plate. And then we get to the talking bodies, and it starts going into, Roe v. Wade being overturned. It starts going into these dangerous abortions being performed, because at the time it was illegal. How was it writing that chapter, and why did you feel it was important to include that? Because it's kind of like this abrupt loss of agency.
Yeah. I mean, I had to go back and rewrite the end of that chapter after last summer. It was one of the last things I could change in the book before the book was done. And my editor and I both cried when we were going over that part, just like the realization of what has been lost and what in a lot of ways was always so up for debate in a way that I don't think it's fair to do to a person's body. The reason I wanted to include that is because And this goes back to Claudette and goes back even further. Pregnancy and girlhood have always been in relationship to each other. Claudette gets pregnant as a teenager, and it's not the first thing that discounts her from the movement, but it's part of the movement moving away from her. When we talk about like innocence and innocence lost, a teenage girl getting pregnant is always going to be part of that story. And I really wanted to include in that chapter the fact that pregnant teenage girls have actually been tremendous fighters for change, insisted on continuing to get an education, participated in really important civil cases that laid the groundwork for Title IX, which is what gives girls equal access to education. That's not maybe who you have in mind when you think about progressive leaders, but pregnant girls were part of that story. So I really wanted to include that. But I also think, to what we were talking about before, it's not honest to talk about girlhood or young womanhood and not talk about the ways that young women can be undone. And one of the things that can happen is to lose agency over your body. You're just starting to find your voice and seize your platform. And then you come to learn, actually, you don't have as much control as you thought. That confrontation is such a big part of growing up in so many ways. To think I can do anything, and then to have the world tell you, no, you can't. And the state deciding what you can and can't do with your body is the ultimate expression of that. And I also wanted to talk about the creative and interesting ways that girls fought against that. I mean, this story isn't in the book, but in December, I wrote for the Washington Post about girls now who are distributing Plan B on campus to make sure that whatever the status of Roe v. Wade or abortion access, they're doing that thing that we were talking about of knowing their neighbors, being involved in their communities, providing services. I like to think the people who invented Jane, the abortion service, would be so impressed by the way these girls are organizing. So I wanted to talk about the hard part about it, but I also wanted to say it's lighting a fire in people, because they are not about to discover just how much they have to say and then be silenced. And that the fight against that, I think, is like a major battleground for young women today.
Yeah. I honestly wonder how many unwed pregnant teenagers kind of got dispelled from history, but were really a part of it. Because I feel like Claudette, she's kind of an interesting case in that, I mean, her story was still, cast to the side, but the fact that she's now kind of being unveiled a little bit to America is really interesting. Okay, I just kind of want to round this out with, if you could describe this book to anyone, well, to a girl, what would you say is the importance of it? What was it? Why did it come to your heart?
Yeah, I would say the book is a recounting of the ways that girls have seized power and demanded it throughout American history, the lengths they went to make their voices heard, the places, some very unlikely places, where they found a megaphone and insisted on speaking into it. But I also think it's actually just the story of American history. It happens to be told through dozens of girls who've done incredible things. But I think if we're really honest, this story is the story of American progress. I told it through the lens of teenage girls, but you can read it and see exactly how we've gotten better, how we've fallen short. And the people who just so happen to be on the forefront of those efforts were teenage girls. I feel like, whether you recognize it or not, we are all very comfortable with the history of teenage boys because we read about wars all the time and we watch movies about great battles all the time. We think of those things as just history. Well, that's the history of teenage boys. And I wanted to provide a history of teenage girls that told the story of social progress in this country. And yeah, I just happened to keep finding them. So that's what I would say about the book. It's a story of American history, and it's for everybody.
Thank you so much for talking to me about this book.
Thank you so much for asking such good questions.
Of course. I mean, there were so many questions to ask. I almost kind of wanted to go through every girl and just be like, can you tell me more about her? Because, it's just something you never know. And like you said, it is just American history, but just told through a lens that we've never really had in history books.
Yeah, totally.
So thank you for that. Now I'm going to invite ER to come back and tell you more about getting the book.
Thank y'all so much for this beautiful conversation. I learned a lot, and Mattie, I love your definition of girlhood, and that feels like such an empowering definition. And I hope more folks will hear that and feel that. And
God, I hope so too.
yeah, like what a great way to relate to that mystical phase of life, right?
Yeah.
That liminal time. So I want to let folks know you can click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen to buy Young and Restless, The Girls Who Sparked America's Revolutions from Karis. Really does help us when you buy event books from us. So, but you can also please request that your public library carry this book. That is part of the activism that we hope people are doing. We really want this book to be in libraries and accessible to people. We think this would be a great book for you to purchase and donate to school libraries because, there's some folks out there trying to take books out of high school libraries, and we need to put books like this into high school libraries. So don't be shy. Act entitled as a parent and put some books in the library. And if you're a young person watching this, ask your school librarian or the person that does the acquisitions for your school if this is a book that they could carry. Because what we hear from librarians all the time is, I would love to do more, but it has to come from a student or it has to come from a parent. So the word on the street is, don't be shy. Ask for what you want. And books like this are really, really key in making sure that we do know these stories that so many of us were not taught. So, Mikayla, thank you again for your beautiful questions and all of your preparation. And Mattie, best of luck with this book. I can't wait to read more of your writing, but I know you need a break after this, so no pressure. Please do come back if and when you write your next book. We'd love to have you. I think even more of a fashion history. We'd be here for it. Just saying.
Okay, good to know. I'll tell my editor.
Yeah. All right, y'all. Well, thanks so much. Have a great night. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.